The civil rights movement is one of these time periods that is really hard to narrow down, and there's a lot of information that we want to cover. The civil rights movement actually began in the 1950s, but some of the more memorable events are going to be in the 1960s. So we want to focus on what you need to know about this time period. There's, of course, a lot of things that we're going to leave out, but this is my focused attempt of what you should know. You should know that there are two goals of the civil rights movement: equal treatment and then the right to vote. So if you don't understand what they were fighting for in equal treatment and in for their right to vote, you're not going to understand the civil rights movement. So when I say equal treatment, what am I talking about? Unequal treatment of African Americans began way back at the end of the Civil War. With the end of the Civil War, slavery was abolished, but African Americans were not given the same free, unfettered access to the same things that whites could. And it started almost immediately. You have to remember black codes. Black codes are going to restrict the movement of African Americans right after the Civil War. Of course, there's a huge lack of workforce when slavery was abolished, and so by passing these black codes, they could arrest African Americans for vagrancy. They insisted that they have jobs. Of course, whites wouldn't hire them for just any jobs, so they ended up working oftentimes back on plantations that they were once slaves at. So immediately after the Civil War, you've got this unequal treatment. As we move forward, you remember Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow laws were laws that made it okay for African Americans to move around freely, but they couldn't access or use the same facilities as white people. So that's why in the previous slide you had the white water fountain and the black water fountain. You had white bathrooms and you had black bathrooms. You had white food counters and you had black food counters. So you basically had these groups of people living side by side, not integrated, not together. You need to remember that Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that basically said that it was okay for this segregation to be that it was okay for segregation, that separate but equal facilities was just fine. So that's what they're going to try to fight against in the civil rights movement, this unequal treatment. So what are we talking about when we say the right to vote? In the South, especially in the South, when African Americans went to vote, they were faced with a lot of problems. One, there may be literacy tests. Well, African Americans were highly illiterate. They were coming at it from being slaves, and they oftentimes didn't have access to very good schools. There may be poll taxes. Well, they were definitely not very wealthy, so it may be expensive for them to vote. And there just might be all-out deceit. They would go to vote, and the person at the poll may say, "Oh, well, you didn't fill out this form correctly. You're not eligible to vote," and they weren't educated to know that, well, they could, or something like that. So, especially in the South, African Americans were being prevented from voting. And in the civil rights movement, we're going to see an emergence of this belief that they've had all these promises that have been broken to them. So what do I mean by broken promises? Well, remember all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. African Americans are going to say that we have the exact same rights as white people, and we want to have the same rights that are guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence that is promised to white people is promised to us as well. Of course, you've got the more obvious. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment granted African American citizenship. So if you're a citizen, you should have access to the same things as everyone else. The 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. So you have federal laws that are being ignored by states, or the states are imposing laws, black codes, Jim Crow laws, that basically override federal laws, and no one's doing anything to enforce it. There are steps in the right direction. Remember the Fair Employment Act. The Fair Employment Act desegregated military jobs during World War II. President Truman is going to establish the Civil Rights Commission, which is going to look into helping African Americans get jobs that they're entitled to. He's also going to integrate the military. But these are steps. The first real battleground for the civil rights movement is going to begin with schools. You can clearly see where separate but equal is not correct when it came to schools. You had black schools and you had white schools. White schools were often better maintained. Teachers in white schools were paid more. Students may live close to a white school, but they were having to spend an hour or more on a bus going across town to the black school. So you could clearly see that separate but equal was not true. And so they're going to attempt to integrate the schools. And this is done in a very important Supreme Court case, which you're going to need to remember. You need to remember Brown versus Board of Education, because Brown versus Education is going to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson, because remember Plessy versus Ferguson said that separate but equal was okay, and it said that no, and you need to integrate schools. Well, again, this is another promise, and we're going to see it attempted, but not all schools are going to integrate. This is going to be a process. For example, in Little Rock, there was a famous group of students. They're called the Little Rock Nine. And when the school was told that they must integrate, there were riots. There were just terrible things. The students were in danger. So the president actually had to send in the National Guard to walk these 9 students to school, and they did that for a year, and then at the end of the school year the governor closed the school. So you can see that there is a definite pushback for integration, but when the Supreme Court makes a ruling that says separate but equal is not okay, that's a battle won, and legal battles are very important. And you're going to see, well, if integration is okay for schools, then why not lunch counters? Why not buses? So they're going to start taking measures of non-violence to show the separation between whites and blacks. And they're going to do this. One method would be with sit-ins, and you need to know what a sit-in is. A sit-in basically is people would come to a particular place, let's say Woolworth's counter, the 5 and dime lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they sit down. They're not throwing fists, they're not doing anything but just simply sitting, asking to be served. So on the first day at Woolworth's, there were 4 men, and they stayed at the lunch counter till closing. The next day they came back and they brought 15 people, and by the third day they had 300, and then the next day they had 1,000. So sit-ins are going to spread across the country, and people are going to realize that, you know, this is something we need to address, and that separate but equal is not okay. Of course, the most famous method of nonviolence used during the civil rights movement would be boycotts. And the most famous, of course, would be when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, and they boycotted the Montgomery bus system. 65% of buses were used by black people. So when they decided not to ride the buses, it crippled the bus system, right? You have to have passengers, supply and demand. If there's no passengers, you don't have a bus system. Rosa Parks is not just some woman who was tired and decided that she didn't want to, give up her seat, and that there were white seats that she could sit in. She was an activist. She was actively involved and was actually picked by Martin Luther to help start this movement. The civil rights movement picked events and did things to bring attention to the problem, and one way they did this was in marches. The most famous march, of course, is going to be the March on Washington, where thousands of people go to Washington to protest and demand equal rights. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. is going to give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Again, this is all very peaceful. It involves black and white people, but another important thing to note is that it's very public, right? The media is there. It gets a lot of attention, and it brings to America's attention the issue. Media plays a huge role in the events that they chose and what they chose to do. So we're going to look at some of the campaigns that they did choose. The ones that you need to know about are going to be, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott, which we talked about, which involved Miss Rosa Parks, the Birmingham campaign, Freedom Summer, the Selma March, and the March on Washington. And these were all chosen because they knew that they would get attention. So let's look at the Birmingham campaign. In the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama, right, Deep South, was the most racially divided city in the United States, both by law and just culturally. Black citizens are going to face legal and economic disparities. You're going to have violence against people from white cops against blacks who try to bring attention to the situation. Birmingham is going to have no black police officers, no black firefighters, sales clerks, department stores, bus drivers, bank tellers, or bank cashiers. So basically, black people were relegated to jobs that involved manual labor, like Birmingham's steel mill. So they started a boycott and sit-ins and marches in Birmingham, and it was organized by Martin Luther King Jr. And violence that was perpetrated against these people was televised. You had images of dogs attacking these peaceful protesters. You had pictures of water cannons being shot into groups of children. So it really brought to the forefront of the Americans' minds, well, what are we? What are we as a nation? And of course, this does come after World War II, where we had just liberated Jewish Holocaust, where the Germans had been racist against the Jews, and so we had a very deep, well, what of our own selves? You can't point to someone else. You can't point to the Germans and their racism against the Jews when we may be just as racist at home. So the Birmingham campaign did cripple Alabama, and it did sort of bring the city to its knees. Another famous campaign that you need to be aware of is the Freedom Summer. The Freedom Summer was an effort to get African Americans registered to vote, and they were faced with constant harassment. Over the course of the 10-week project, 4 civilian rights workers were killed. At least 3 Mississippi blacks were murdered because of their support for the civil rights movement. 4 were critically wounded. 80 Freedom Summer workers were beaten. 1,062 people were arrested. This is including whites and blacks. 37 churches were bombed. So in Mississippi, basically, it's burning and it's being televised and on TV. And one of the sadder stories to come out of it was that there were 2 civil rights volunteers, and one of them was African American, and they disappeared after they left a jail. They were arrested, they were released, and then all of a sudden they disappeared. Well, later they found their bodies, and of course they were murdered. So The nation is polarized black and white. You need to know about the Freedom March, or the Freedom March, the March on Washington. It's one of the largest political rallies for human rights in the United States, and it called for civil and economic rights for all African Americans. Thousands of Americans headed to Washington. This is, of course, where Martin Luther King Jr. is going to give his famous I Have a Dream speech. This march is credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act, and it's also going to motivate the Selma Montgomery March, which we'll look at next. And the Selma Montgomery March is what led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Because remember, there's two pieces, right? We're seeking equal treatment and the equal rights to vote. From this picture, of course, you can note, here's the meat. It's important to note the man in the corner. Everything's being recorded and televised. So let's look at the Selma Montgomery March, and that's going to summarize a lot of what's going on. I think this video sums up the civil rights movement pretty well.
600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday, March 7th, to begin the march to Montgomery.
Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday,
Dr. King was preaching in Atlanta. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led the march.
King was preaching in Atlanta.
Lewis chose to march even though his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opposed SCLC's strategy and decided not to take part. Surprisingly, as they walked through the center of town, there were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Safety to continue this march, and I'm paying attention to unlawful assembly. Go home or go to your church. This march will not continue. Go home or go to your church. This march will not continue.
Sensing the mood of the country, addressed Congress on national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is
8 days after Bloody Sunday, 4 days after Reeb's death, the President asked for a comprehensive voting rights bill and astonished the nation by using the words of the movement.
Must be our cause too.
Their cause must
So
be
it's
our
not
cause
just
too.
Negroes, but really it's all of
It's
us
not just Negroes,
who must
but really it's all of
overcome
us
the crippling legacy
who
of
must
bigotry
overcome the
and injustice.
crippling legacy of bigotry.
And we shall
and injustice.
overcome.
We shall overcome.
Judge Johnson has just ruled that we have a legal and constitutional right to march in Selma to Montgomery.
The judge's action cleared the way for it, but Governor Wallace still refused to provide the necessary protection. So President Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard. Sunday, March 21st. Only 62 days after the campaign began, 3,200 people gathered at Brown Chapel Church for the journey to Montgomery.
We are going to walk non-violently and peacefully
So that's the sum
Let
up to
the
Montgomery
nation and the
March.
world
And so
know
you know
we
that
are
the right
tired
to
now.
assemble is a civil right,
We've
and
lived with
they
slavery
were
and
just
segregation
peacefully
345 years. We waited
participating in
a
this
long
march, and
time
you
for
had these
freedom.
images that were strewn across
We
the
are
entire
trying
hills
to
via
remind
the
the
TV
nation
of them
of
being
the urgency of the
run
moment.
down by
Now is the
people on
time
horses. These are scenes
to
that
make real the promises
you
of
and I can't even
democracy.
imagine. If we
Now
watch
is
this
the
today, we'd
time
think that this was happening
to
in a different
transform
country, and this was
Alabama,
happening in
the heart of
Montgomery,
Dixie,
Alabama.
to a
So
state with a heart for
Johnson, of course,
brotherhood and peace
immediately
and
addresses
goodwill.
the nation,
Now is
and
the
he's going
time to make
to
justice
pass
a reality for all
through
the
some
God's
important
children.
civil rights legislation, which we'll look at.
Let's move the line a little faster.
We're marching on to freedom land. We're marching on to freedom land. 'Cause our strength from day to day as we walk the narrow way. We're going forward. We're going forward. One day we're going to be free. We're marching on the freedom land.
54 miles and 5 days marching. They were now 25,000 strong.
As we travel the narrow way.
Marching together and listening to Martin's speech.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. And that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
You want to make sure that you understand the importance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm sure you know of him, but he was very instrumental. He helped to organize the Birmingham campaign. When he was in Birmingham, he was jailed, and he wrote a very famous letter, a letter from Birmingham jail, which was sent out and became just sort of the literature of the movement. Of course, he did the March on Washington. He was instrumental in keeping the civil rights movement going. So after Selma to Montgomery, we're going to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and the easiest way to understand it is to read it. It says, to enforce the constitutional right to vote, to confer jurisdiction upon the district courts of the United States, to provide injunctive relief against discrimination in public accommodations, to authorize the Attorney General to institute suits to protect constitutional rights in public facilities and public education, to extend the Commission on Civil Rights, to prevent discrimination in federally assisted programs, to establish a Commission on Equal Opportunity and Equal Employment Opportunity, and for other purposes. And of course it goes on. But this is what they had been working towards. The president to pass a federal law stating that they have equal rights and cannot be taken away by the states, which are just basically overriding federal law. So this is what you need to know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, etc. It's signed by President Johnson. It ended segregation in schools, work, public places. So if you need a summary, that's what you need to remember. Along with the Civil Rights Act, you need to remember the Voting Rights Act. Again, signed by President Johnson, it's going to protect voting rights. Again, especially because of down in the South where they had all the Jim Crow laws. You can no longer have literary tests. You can no longer have knowledge tests. And he's actually going to send people down during polling, during election days, to make sure that they're not turning African Americans away from the polls. The Civil Rights Movement, of course, is amazing and spectacular in and of itself, but it definitely was influential for other civil rights movements, especially for women. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, is going to take inspiration from the civil rights movement. We'll study them a little bit more in detail, but they're going to try to get past their own Equal Rights Act for women, and it's going to spur the women's right movement. So what happened? Well, change is slow, and that's what you need to realize, is that even with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and Board versus Education, integration did not just happen overnight. And you're going to see a change in leadership as we move forward. We're going to have the Black Power movement. We're going to see a change from Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, the Black Panthers, and we're also going to see, as the movement became more militant in the urban areas especially, the TV is going to go from recording these peaceful marches where the white man is beating on the black to the urban areas where it's images of black people setting fires and riots. And that's going to start swaying public opinion. And again, we see the importance of the TV and media coverage. So let's look at Carmichael, or Stokely Carmichael. He is a leader in the SNCC. Now, the SNCC is a Student Nonviolence Coordination Committee. This committee was founded by Martin Luther King Jr. and helped to start the Birmingham movements, and it was peaceful. And Carmichael started off peaceful. But he was at a march, and this is after some of these civil rights acts had been passed, and the police start coming into the march, and they're beating on people, and he sees, there's really not any change here. And he's overheard saying, well, we need Black power. And that's sort of a theme of believing that the Black people needed to rise up, and they didn't necessarily maybe need to integrate, but they needed to become powerful in their own right. And this idea of Black power began building up a sense of pride in African American race. And eventually they're going to break away from the SNCC. And Carmichael actually joined another movement called the Black Panthers. Another you need to be familiar with, the leader you need to be familiar with is Malcolm X. He's going to be even more militant than Carmichael. He's going to actually defend and say that it's okay for Black people to beat up on white people, or for Blacks to rise up against whites because they've been oppressed for so long. So he's for Black power by any means necessary. And he's also advocating for this sort of separate, no longer working together peacefully, but almost a Black nation in and of itself. He's going to join the Nation of Islam, and his ideas and his words are going to lay again for the idea of Black power movement or Black supremacy. the Black Power movement wasn't all militant. It was a lot of celebrating what it meant to be African American. You're going to have James Brown singing "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." The women are going to go around saying "Black is beautiful." You're going to have distinct hairstyles, that poofy black hairstyles. So it's not all militant, but the Black Power movement leads to the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is going to take Black Power one step further, and they're going to start taking up arms and aiding their communities against police brutality. They're going to take up Chairman Mao's political power comes through the power of a gun, and it's going to become sort of their credo. They issued a party platform in the sort of the same framework as the Declaration of Independence. Remember, we looked at the Declaration of Independence of the grievances against Britain, and so here are the grievances of the Black Panther Party against the white people. We want full employment for our people. We believe that the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man employment or a guaranteed income. We believe that if the white American businessmen will not give full employment, then the means of production should be taken from the businessmen and placed in the community so that the people of the community can organize and employ all of its people and give a high standard of living. So we've gone from peaceful protests under Martin Luther King Jr. to a more militant Black Panther movement. And it's going to lose steam as we head into the Vietnam War period, but you do need to be aware that it did take on this aspect, especially in the urban communities where they didn't really see the segregation as much as they did in the South. They just saw a lot of economic poverty, right? They wanted the white people were getting all the jobs, the black people were living in the inner cities, and then so they start rising up and rioting, and those riots are portrayed on the TV, and the white people get scared. So you need to know that all of the events in the civil rights movements that I listed are the ones that you need to know about specifically, and of course understand that it started out nonviolent, and it did see many achievements in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and in the Voting Rights Act, and that it did influence other civil rights movements, which we'll talk about. But the slow change led to some frustration, and we will leave it at that. Of course, if you want to look up any more information on the different civil rights leaders or the movements, that's definitely something that you can do.